Banks, there's a really critical scene where he, played by Tom Hanks, Walt Disney is talking to the author of Mary Poppins, and he's finally able to connect with her when he comes to the realization that Mary Poppins is the story about her father, and he shares with that author, some of his own challenges and his own experiences with his own father. And, so Walt, had a difficult childhood. He was a man who chased his dreams, but more often than not, he was also chased by his own nightmares. And a lot of those nightmares came from his childhood experiences. His very first studio in Kansas City would go bankrupt, and it was that bankruptcy that would prompt him to move out to California and eventually into Hollywood. He would lose to Universal and a fellow by the name of Charles Mintz, his very first successful character, a little fellow by the name of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. It was the loss of Oswald and the emergency that loss created that forced him to come up with something completely new and different. You may have heard of him, a little fellow by the name of Mickey Mouse.
No clue.
Clue at all. Then he would go on to do the world's first full-length animated feature film. Nobody believed in it. Nobody believed in him. His brother Roy, who was the financier at the studio, wanted nothing to do with it. His own wife Lily didn't believe anybody would sit through a full-length animated feature film. And then he went through it all over again when it came to his dream for Disneyland. Lily, looked at him and said, "Walt, why? Why do you want an amusement park? Those places are filthy." And when he said to Roy, let's build an amusement park, Roy's response really was, Walt, you've had some crazy ideas in your day, and I've let you do most of them. There's no way we're going to build an amusement park. And everything that he set out to do, Blake, the experts in the field said you cannot do it
Absolutely.
That way. You will go bankrupt. You will be closed in less than a year.
Absolutely.
And so knowing that story, I think in order to fully appreciate everything that you're experiencing when you are at Disneyland, you need to know that backdrop. You need to know that backstory. And again, whatever that crazy idea, that crazy thought, whatever your dream might be, it's okay that it's difficult. It's okay that there's conflict. It's okay that people don't believe in it. It just makes you the next Walt Disney.
True. Very, very true. Actually, I wrote this down as you were talking. You're talking about the history of Walt Disney. How did you think PBS did with their 2-night special a few months back? I thought that was fantastic.
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I only had a couple of criticisms, which, quite frankly, for me as an academician, is relatively rare. First of all, I didn't quite understand why they brought up Marceline at the point in the film that they did, and that's more of an editing issue than anything else. Right. Walt's 4 to 5 years in Marceline, Missouri, were absolutely formative. That's where he fell in love with the railroad. That's where he first started doing his very first drawings, and of course, it's Marceline that serves as the inspiration for Main Street USA in Disneyland, Disney World, and the other Disney parks. And I didn't feel like they gave Marceline nearly enough time. And even when they brought it up, it didn't feel like it fit very, very well there. Other than that, I thought they did a fantastic job, and I loved every single second and every single minute of it. My wife and I, we've actually rewatched it a couple of times, and I can't recommend it enough. If you're interested in Walt Disney and who he was as a person and as a visionary leader, it's going to be, some of the best 4 hours you've ever spent.
Yeah, I usually am not able to sit for like 4 hours. I'm a wrestling fan, and I have problems sitting for 3-hour pay-per-views sometimes. So to sit for a 4-hour documentary, that just shows how good it was. Because I was intrigued by if they were going to go all the dark stuff, especially during the strike and everything else. I was wondering how much they were going to go into detail, and I was very surprised at how much detail they went into and how dark they really went with certain things. I appreciated it.
Yeah, and some people feel as though it was a little too dark and it was a little too negative. I didn't get that sense at all, and I'm a big defender of Walt Disney. And in my own book, I don't mention the strike at all, not because I don't think it's important or I don't think it didn't ever happen. I really wanted to write as positive a book that serves as a source of motivation and inspiration, and I just didn't see it as necessary. But the bottom line is the strike did happen, and it was incredibly important, and there were some negative, nasty things that occurred during the course of it. And in fact, one of the guest lecturers in my History of Disneyland course, Sam Genoway, who's the author of several Disney books to include the Disneyland story, what he will say to students is that the strike left such a scar on Walt that he never really re-engaged movie making again in the same way, or at least at the same level. And he needed something new and different to do, and ultimately that became Disneyland. And so he would make the argument that if it weren't for the strike, we might not ever get Disneyland, because he probably would have stayed happy with his animators and his filmmakers.
Oh, that's a good point. I never thought about it that way. I never did think about it that way. That's a good point. I was just thinking, actually, in your class with the students, what topic really surprises them? Like, there has to be one thing that comes up that always kind of surprises people. Because I know, like, there's always history there, history lessons. What surprises people in your class more than anything else?
There's three moments that I've taught the class enough I always sort of look forward to, because I know they're going to be jaw-dropping moments. First, and we've talked about it a little bit, I start the class with a lecture on the Walt Disney of Disneyland. And the mere idea that he had a difficult childhood or ever went bankrupt or ever had a failure, they're just shocked and stunned. They have absolutely no idea. And you can see them, sit up a little bit and like, well, wow, I've had a couple of setbacks in my life, maybe it's okay, and maybe my dreams can still come true as well. So I think that's a really important lesson and a really important lecture. When we go to the opening of Disneyland, we go back and watch, you can find it on YouTube, the original hour and 15-minute opening day broadcast that was live to 90 million people on July 17th, 1955. Students have no idea who Art Linkletter was. They have no clue who Bob Cummings was, and they are shocked that President Reagan is there as one of the MCs. They're always really, really blown away when Ronald Reagan comes onto the screen. And, because, students struggle a little bit with dates and U.S., I have to make sure they understand now he was not president of the United States in 1955. We're still, 30 years away from that. But they know who he is, and they're sort of impressed that Walt Disney managed to get the president there for the opening of Disneyland. And
that's funny.
And then the third moment, which is probably my favorite lecture, if you have been only to Disney World in Florida and you haven't been to Disneyland, then it's sort of hard to appreciate how similar and yet different the parks are. Well, reverse that here in Southern California. We end up with students who've always been to Disneyland. They've always had a pass. They go, once, twice, 3 times a month, and yet they've never been out of the state of California, so they've never even had a chance to go to Florida, go to Disney World. And when I put up on the screen, it's a wonderful Google Map image, the 150 times size difference between Disneyland and Disney World, you could hear a pin drop in the room. They have no idea of how different the size and scale and scope of the two parks really, really is.
Well, I have a question. In Disneyland area, we have, of course, Disneyland. We also have California Adventure that is now turned into like Cars Land and Buena Vista Street. What do you think of the expansion on that end? I mean, Disneyland, your love there. What about your love of what about California Adventure and now Cars Land, really, what it is now?
Well, Disney California Adventure opened in February of 2001, and even though we weren't living in Southern California at the time, we did have the opportunity to go in the summer of 2001, and I was a little disappointed. Now, I'm not going to say that I jumped online and, posted a bunch of negative stuff against it, which I know over the years that's exactly what happened. A lot of people, particularly the locals who were so in love and so immersed with Disneyland, were really, really put out with what DCA initially was. And we returned to California in 2011, right at the point where they were in the middle of the transition from the old DCA to the new DCA, which, of course, opened in June of 2012 with Buena Vista Street and with Cars Land. I was okay with DCA. I didn't love it. I was okay with it. It's significantly better now. And that's not just because of Buena Vista Street and Cars Land, which I love. It started getting better, with the Hollywood Tower of Terror and Midway, Toy Story Mania, and other enhancements, World of Color, that were sort of, part of the later versions of DCA and not exclusively a part of Buena Vista Street and exclusively a part of Cars Land. I think the biggest challenge for folks is, they didn't include the storytelling elements, at least not initially, that Walt insisted be included and incorporated into Disneyland. That was the biggest piece that was missing. And so now when you walk onto Buena Vista Street, it tells the story of Walt showing up in California in 1923 and leads us all the way to the replica of the Carthay Theater where Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered. I just think that's a wonderful story and a wonderful creative idea. And then as far as Cars Land goes, folks are a little concerned, and you see this in some of the conversations related to the upcoming Star Wars Land, and that is the idea that there's going to be an entire area dedicated and devoted to one movie, one franchise, one intellectual property. Well, I don't think Cars Land is about the Cars movies per se. Yes, they populate that land, and they are a big part of it. But for me, Cars Land is more about Route 66. It's more about the journey from Chicago to Los Angeles, which, of course, is part of the journey that Walt would have taken when he went from the Midwest coming out to California. So I think Cars Land is incredibly immersive, and it's not just telling the story from the Cars movies, but it's really telling the American story. And Route 66 as we have continued to go west over the years.
Well, you actually were talking about the Star Wars Land coming in. I know a lot of people have been freaking out. A lot of things are closing in Disneyland so they can add in Star Wars Land. And in Florida, it's different. There's plenty of room. You can putting it in Hollywood Studios. That's a great place for it. In California, it sounds like it's obviously a small location. So what do you think with Star Wars Land moving into Disneyland as well? Is it going to work? Do you think it's going to work?
I don't know. And what I have chosen to do is sort of suspend judgment and trust Disney and trust the Imagineers with what they're going to come up with. Walt himself said that as long as there is imagination left in the world, Disneyland will never be finished. And he would get frustrated when he made a movie because his technology would grow in advance. The movie that he had made 5 years or 15 years earlier, it was put in the can, so to speak, and it was what it was. And he wanted to build Disneyland as something that would grow and change and adapt and evolve. And we've seen that over the years. I think he would recognize the park that he built some 60 years later if he had the chance to walk through it today. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of things that are new and a lot of things that are different. So Disneyland's always been changing, and that's what Walt wanted. I'm going to miss the old rivers of America. I'm going to miss the way in which somehow miraculously the Mark Twain could take you into the quote-unquote backcountry in the middle of Orange County, in the middle of urban, overpopulated Southern California. But yet at the same time, and I'm not a huge Star Wars buff, I like it. I'm not, obsessed about it. I'm going to trust that they're going to do something really cool and really amazing. And just this week, we were given the opportunity to see the first renderings of what the new river and what the new railroad route are going to look like. It looks really stinking cool. And so I've decided to give Disney the benefit of the doubt and just trust that they're going to do something that wows us, and it's all going to be okay. And if you think about it, they were almost damned if they did and damned if they didn't. If they had stuck Star Wars in Tomorrowland, which some people have suggested, well, then they would have been